Hello, good evening, everyone. Welcome to the Royal Photographic Society's Historical Group. Apologies for the late start this evening. Just some minor technical difficulties beyond all of us, I think. So welcome, and it's a pleasure this evening to hand over to Gilly Reid, the Historical Group's chair, who will introduce our speaker, and we look forward to the evening. Thank you.
Hello, this evening we have Pete Moore for our talk on Alex Ledingham, Grantown's photo artist. Peter's worked in nature conservation for 40 years, but he did have a gap in the middle of this when he took up a career as a photographer, working for magazines, but mainly towards nature conservancies. And he also made an extensive range of postcards, a bit like the man he's going to talk about, actually. Middle 1990s, he began several long-term documentary projects based on the work of Scottish photographer Robert Moyes Adams, exploring changes in the countryside of Scotland. And then he wrote a PhD thesis entitled Photography and Rephotography, Repetition and Places in Time, graduating from the University of Aberdeen in 2016. He has ongoing research interests in the exploration of time and change through repetition, and also in the history of tourism-related photography. He is a Churchill Fellow and a former board of the member of the Scottish Society for the History of Photography. So I hope that wasn't too rushed, Peter.
No, that's great. Thanks, Gilly. Can you hear me? Just confirm you can hear me.
Yes, I can hear you, and off you go now.
Brilliant. And you can see my slide, can you? I can't see what's going on, so
yeah, all good, Peter. Thank you.
Thank you. Let me know if it goes. Okay, sorry everybody about that. The technicalities of Zoom are just slightly beyond me. What I want to do is talk tonight about a small photographic business which was started by Alex Ledingham in the early part of the 20th century in the Highlands of Scotland. I intend to offer a snapshot of the breadth of his work and demonstrate the importance of these provincial studios in the documentation of people and place. I don't think that Ledingham is necessarily unique, but the locations in which he undertook most of his work, the enterprise that he demonstrated through his postcard business, and the affectionate regard with which he and his family are held locally encouraged me to explore his legacy in more detail. I think Gilly's really covered my own sort of introduction. I mean, I live up here in the Highlands, worked independently as a photographer for 7 years before embarking on a career in nature conservation. My interest in photography has been sustained throughout, and particularly its role in the documentation of landscape change. To coin a contemporary term, I took a deep dive into rephotography, broadly the return to the location of an earlier photograph and the repeat of the image. And I began researching for a part-time PhD at University of Aberdeen in 2008, graduating with my thesis, as Gilly says, Photography and Rephotography, Repetition and Places in Time. And those themes will come through, I think, in this talk a little bit. For that research, I wanted to find collections of photographs. I've researched the main practitioners up here through various collections, but became interested in the role of real photograph postcards, RPs for anybody who's in postcard circles, and using those in the mapping of tourism and acting as a source of high quality images. Arising from my study, I settled on Alex Ledingham's work, and in 2022 worked with Grantown Museum to produce a retrospective exhibition of his work, which coincided with the accession of what remains of his archive into their safe care. And we also published a small book, the cover of which you see before you. First, maybe for some of you, it is just an introduction to whereabouts we are. Hopefully the slide has changed there.
Yeah, that's fine, Peter. Thank you.
Great. Thanks, Michael. Here is a map of a part of Scotland where the story is based, the Highlands, the Grampian Highlands, as it used to be called, and now is commonly referred to as the Cairngorms National Park. The park boundary is marked in the slightly darker green, right in the centre of this image, and the bluish green is the administrative boundary of Badenoch and Strathspey, which inevitably I may refer to as I speak. Villages which may be familiar to you within this district include Dalwhinnie, Lagan, Kinusey, Kincraig, Newtonmore, all of which lie in Badenoch, and Aviemore, Nethybridge and Grantown, which lie in Strathspey, so Badenoch and Strathspey. It's the old divisions of about 6 parishes, basically, and has now become an administrative area. Canusie is the capital of Badenoch, which is the lower section on that sort of blue bit on the map, the lower half, basically. And Grantown, which I'll refer to, Grantown and Spey, which I'll typically refer to as Grantown, is the capital of Strathspey. The River Spey runs right through the middle of Badenoch and Strathspey, as does the Highland Railway line, as does the main road artery, the A9, which largely follows the old drove roads and the military road, and then also the A95, which follows the Spey up to the coast. 2 important blue labels are on this map, and they show the town of Forres right at the top there, which is where Alex Ledingham was born, and Grantown on Spey, in the middle of the top part of the Badenoch Strathspey area, which is where his studio was located. If you just hold the thought of that Badenoch area for the next bit, this view shows a distribution of his postcard locations, featuring Alex Ledingham's range of cards. So this is basically where he took his photographs in that area. Quite a few were made before the First World War, and many of them were made between the wars, and we'll have a look at some of those in due course. Alex Ledingham was born in 1883 in Forres. He attended Forres Academy, and in 1901 the census had him left. He had left home and was working as an assistant photographer in Peebles, which is in the Scottish borders, probably about 150 miles away. In 1904 he moved to work for a company called D.W. Profit in Dundee. David Profit was born in 1828 and established his business at 59 the Wellgate in Dundee in 1880. In the latter part of the 19th century and for much of the 20th century, D.W. Profit specialised in photographing school groups. And their photographers, their journeyman photographers, travelled throughout Scotland and Ireland particularly. And it was this work that Alex Ledingham seemed to later develop in his business. He undertook quite a bit of that travel for that purpose. So Ledingham's early work, he made albums of his work, quite sort of, I mean, not, you know, certainly not beautiful. They were quite rudimentary in their production, but it showed a kind of certainly a curation of his images and a desire. So in 1903, he made this one, which is basically a royal visit to Edinburgh in 1903. He got a picture of the King, Edward VII, and also the Queen, along with parade shots of a naval brigade and the Lancers, and put those into one of his albums. There are several albums held by the Ledingham descendants now. In another album, just to give a snapshot, when he was in Dundee, this faded page of his work is entitled Whalers at Dundee, Leaving for the Fishing Grounds. And it's likely these were taken when he was based at Dundee working for profits. Dundee was a busy place at the time, and he chose to photograph aspects of this, one of its industries, and other aspects as well. And this is just an example. I think both these pages show a desire to record events, what we would now refer to as documentary photography. And Alex afforded his work a degree of status by setting out his pictures both for potential display, but also as a record of what was happening. So briefly, just to move back to Grantown and some of the sort of early photography stuff, and I'm sure most of you will be aware of this. Briefly, while Francis Frith dominated much of the tourism photography in England, in Scotland he was relatively quiet. I mean, there are a few examples of his work. He sort of came around, but mainly up here we're looking at the work of George Washington Wilson and James Valentine. These were they ran the main studios in Scotland, working out of Aberdeen and Dundee, respectively. As you're probably aware, one of the significant drivers in both the development of the tourist industry in Scotland and in the establishment of tourist views was Queen Victoria. Her enthusiasm for many, if not all things Scottish, is legendary. And all she had to do was to drop a note of recommendation for a subject to photograph to her favoured studio of the time. And both Valentine and Washington Wilson had royal patronage at some time or other, And they would take this as an equivalent to a royal command and beetle off into the countryside and document whatever scene Queen Victoria had advised them was in her view sort of worth recording. And photographs such as these found their ways into the royal photograph albums, and with the publication of her journals, these towns and views she mentioned became tourist attractions. And from there, a visual souvenir industry just bloomed, really. In the early years, the 1850s and 60s, her souvenirs, these souvenirs were reproduced as carte de visite and as album prints. And then later, at the end of the 19th century, they were produced as postcards. And the legacy of these established views, of course, persists to today. The Queen's view here, the Queen's view there, and that's quite a feature of Scotland. So this is one of the early shots of one of the things that sort of put Grantown and Spey on the map was that the Queen visited there, and she sent a message to Wilson, who turned up, and he made various photographs. And this is a photograph of the Grant Arms Hotel in Grantown, which still stands and still trades. But it's one of the early documents, one of the early documentaries of Grantown. So Ledingham kind of set off on a route of photographing various parts of Grantown when he set up his studio, and I'll go into that in a little bit. But basically what he did was he went for the established views. So, you know, on the left here, you've got a view by Washington Wilson of the Lime Avenue at Castle Grant. And lo and behold, when Ledingham was looking for things to photograph, you know, he chose that as a sort of copy. It was first photographed by Wilson about 1860, and the album was included in the photograph was included in an album created by Prince Albert of the Queen's Highland expeditions, and that's in the Royal Collection. And that endorsement of the image gave Wilson the opportunity to promote the location and his image, which was subsequently copied by Valentine and produced as prints. And then half a century later, it was copied by Alex Ledingham, and the sort of the view of the tourist location kind of was perpetuated. So a little bit about postcards. You know, how do you build a collection of postcards? Well, the pictures you have to show things that people want to purchase, and either to keep or to send to someone else, and therefore they quite often had to fit a conventional narrative. Ledingham's early photography followed an 18th and early 19th century model, where the wild and romantic Highlands were avidly consumed and collected by tourist travellers. This in turn found its origins back in the 18th century, when William Gilpin set out to prescribe the picturesque. Gilpin defined picturesque as a term expressive of that peculiar kind of beauty which is agreeable in a picture. To inform his theories, Gilpin made a series of tours during the late 1760s and 1770s, keeping and later publishing his journals in which he described his rules for the appreciation of the picturesque, using local examples and illustrating his theories with his own wash illustrations. Gilpin's work was about making a picture. He was anxious to teach his readers the rules. He described composition as the foundation of all picturesque beauty, asserting that no beauty of light, colouring or execution could atone for the want of composition. Mountains had to be an elegant and varied line. Roughness and a certain amount of chaos was desirable. Distant views, if there is a good foreground, are generally most pleasing. Fast forward to Queen Victoria, she sought similar experiences 70 or 80 years later. Expansive views, if you think the Queen's views of the various places in Scotland, down on Loch Tummel, for example, high mountains, tumbling rivers, the burns, waterfalls and glens bedecked with ferns and mosses. It was not only Gilpin's compositional ideals that were influential in the selection of subject matter for artists and photographers. The itinerary of his travels, during which he visited locations and promoted them as places where his readers would experience the picturesque, undoubtedly exposed both a cachet and endorsement on locations, fueling popularity and making them fashionable places to visit. Ledingham identified and photographed the local scenes to serve a local tourist market using those conventions in his early postcards, and probably unwittingly adopting Gilpin's influence and similarly translating the influences of Queen Victoria. So here you've got two local views, a picture of what's called Huntley's Cave, which is just north in the county of Moray, just north of Grantown, and the Dulwich Falls in Grantown-on-Spey itself. Now, these are very minor kind of reproductions of other photographs by the larger studios. On the left, you have a sort of a rocky landscape, moss-clad, fern-bound, shady, trees overhanging, water running through it, all of which is part of the picturesque and the romantic. On the right-hand side, what is actually a very modest waterfall. And photographs abound, certainly in the Valentine and Washington Wilson archives, of these towering waterfalls in other parts of the country. This is what Grantown-on-Spey had and has, and it is extremely modest, but nonetheless captured here in a postcard, following that kind of theme. So while Ledingham, just to go back to Ledingham's business, while he was away at DW Profit in Dundee, and this was in 1907, there were signs that one of the local photographers in Forres was in trouble. Alexander Torrey, who had studios in Forres and also in Grantown, hit financial difficulties, and by the Christmas of 1907, he was declared bankrupt. Ledingham, from his job in Dundee, saw an opportunity to get home and swooped and very shrewdly purchased the studio at Grantown. And he also purchased Torrey's back catalogue of negatives and was able to provide reprints from those to his customers while his own business was established. So it's a sound business model, and you can see this is from the Elgin and Nairn Gazette, 25th of March 1908, and kind of sets out exactly how he's going to run his business. So I've been able to pin down the date of this particular photograph. This is a glass plate. When I made a scan of it, the headline on the billboard, or one of the headlines on the billboard, is describing country house ghosts, baronet's experience, which was a thing in September of 1909. And you can Google it and find out what the intrigue of that was. But this is a year after Alex Ledingham set up his shop at 60 the High Street in Grantown-on-Spey. And you can see it right in the middle of the frame there, Alex Ledingham, photo artist. And one of the links during my researches that I came across was unable to untangle slightly during this exercise, was the very close association between Alex Ledingham and Angus Stewart, who had the shop right next door to him. And Angus was an extremely influential in Grantown as the publisher of the Grantown Supplement, a local newspaper. He actually had a printing works at the back of his shop. And he undoubtedly was a driving force behind much in the town at the time. Alex and Angus, they had these neighbouring premises, one serving the other and providing material for the other. The two businesses were complementary, mutually beneficial to each other, and Angus's sudden and tragic demise by drowning in the River Spey almost certainly pushed Alex Ledingham into the world of publishing his own postcards. I think otherwise he would have probably just continued the relationship that he had. And you can see on the outside of the shops, there are long strips of boards hanging outside there, which are showing the postcards that are on sale at both the premises, and they were largely Ledingham's photographs. This was an early commission that survives in the Grantown Museum archive, and it's a magnificent presentation portrait of a postman called Angus Grant. It marks his retirement. You can see his medals. He's got Crimea medals and goodness knows what else on his chest. And the inscription reads, "From his friends on the braes of Castle Grant." Now, this bit is one of many links for Ledingham being a photo artist, because what this is an original photograph, and it originated from a photographic studio portrait, but is created as a painting, an oil painting over the top of the photograph. So it's been hand tinted in parts to recreate to create a kind of a very special kind of memento. So it's oil painted over the photograph. Other kind of studio examples of Ledingham's work. I mean, he did a lot of studio photography, and also posted these as postcards, and these are two of sort of a basket weaving model. There are various ones in his sort of wider archive of sort of people dressing up and you know, doing certain things, rural crafts. And again, I think this is a slightly romantic throwback, and just harnessing some of that sort of rural idyll in a photograph. Next one is a local hotelier in her wedding dress. The wedding dress actually survives. It's in New Zealand these days, but it was a sort of fantastic crinoline affair. And again, she features in a studio portrait by Ledingham. And one of my favourite ones is on the left here of a little jockey, Shona Grant, who was, I don't know, about 5 or 6 in that picture, and just to sort of put some of the threads onto exactly, you know, the sort of the ties that Ledingham had in Grantown. On the right hand side is a later picture, and Shona is on the right there. She's part of she's a member of the pipe band, and that's a pipe band picture taken in the back of somebody's garden in Grantown on Spey. Now that one again, Ledingham didn't really do colour photography, and that one is another hand painted one, and even in close detail, all the lines on the tartan of their kilts are actually hand drawn. They're actually hand put in with blocks of colour put over the on the reds, but they are magnificent sort of photo artist works, and just sort of follows that through. And then just to sort of complete that particular circle, when we launched the book and had the exhibition last year, Shona came along, and she's about 90 something now, and in really good spirits. But that's Shona there at the exhibition, and great to see it was. So the thing that Ledingham excelled in the early part of his career was setting about recording notable local events. Locally, this is a remarkably well-kent photograph. He did a series of pictures of the funeral of one of the local lairds, the Honourable Caroline, Countess Dowager of Seafield. Grantown is basically right beside the Seafield estates, Castle Grant, and the funeral was a massive local event. Other such articles other such events will be things like the return of the Earl and Countess here, and this is what they call a tenantry arch, which was built in Grantown. There's actually 2 of them there. Welcome to the Laird of Grant, to the land to the land of his fathers. And this was put together in tenantry arch in August 1914. So by contrast to the printed process, which was both expensive and of poor quality, Alex began to produce kind of limited run postcards of the local events, which people bought. And I used my index for what people bought. It's a very rough and ready one, unscientific. But basically, if I can find it on eBay, then, you know, there was a few published. If I can't find it, and it's only in 1 or 2 sort of places, or very scarce to find, then, you know, I get some kind of an index from that. But this just kind of shows the investment of the locals and the close links with the estate and the lairds at the time. The other thing I wanted to say was just, and at some point I may come back to it, but it's just really to note the importance of these photographs. You know, in this archive which we're looking at here, a lot of the archive is not collected together. It's in individual postcard collections, it's in family collections, it's in museum collections, it's scattered completely all over the place. But these postcards are probably the only record of these events. Certainly the actual plates that these were taken on do not exist anymore, and there's remarkably few of those. I've taken quite a couple of 15 years probably looking for the glass plates in various collections. They don't exist. What exists is basically real photograph postcards, and that's quite a, you know, they are the only surviving record, and you know, for me have very, very significant, you know, importance. Things like the opening of the War Memorial after the First World War, obviously 1921 this was, so huge crowds gathering. Ledingham was there to record the event. This is the local laird and the countess and various. There's a provost there on the various provosts on the right hand side with their ermine robes. But again, Ledingham is right in there and photographing these events, documenting and recording what was going on in Grantown and Spey. This one, I think, is a magnificent photograph as well. This is the departure of soldiers from Grantown into the Great War, and this is the old Grantown East railway station, which was well, closed as a result of the beaching cuts in the 1960s. It's clearly a public event, a notable public event, ably documented by Alex Ledingham. Ledingham was at this time was in his 30s. He'd been running his business for about 7 to 8 years, and he didn't sign up. He tried to get a kind of a sort of leave of absence from signing up, and it was only the Military Service Act in 1916 when he was called up that basically put him on a timescale. He was slightly older as a recruit, but when the Service Act came in, he was called to arms, and both he and William Stewart both delayed their conscription for a short while on the basis of running their businesses, and he didn't go until September 1916. Alex didn't. He joined the Royal Engineers and was able at that point in time to be able to use his photographic skills as part of his service. Another neat link of a Ledingham photograph here, and right out of the sort of the DW Prophet workbook is a photograph that's called The Moss Gatherers, and this was a, a photograph of the grammar school children from Grantown who were out in 1916 collecting moss for bandaging and war wounds, particularly after the Somme. And these bags that are in the foreground here and the baskets, the kids were all out there gathering mosses, sphagnum moss from the woods around Grantown, and sending that off as part of the war effort. And they were, again, Ledingham will have been out there and gathering them together and collating this picture like this as a record. Later on, things like the Home Guard, again, he was still at it years later, but just again, groups of people were really his thing. These are all names, people who we can name and find out. Great photo elicitation opportunity, and for Grantown, and I think also slightly wider in a Highland context, these are important photographs, clear, sharp, well curated, and you know, just sort of brilliant to have as a record of life in Grantown on Spey. He also recorded flood events. There were some pretty serious flood events that he covered. This one is the Highland Line being blown out by a flood of the Baden Gorm burn in 1914. It happened about 9 years later as well. It was one of the huge kind of a sort of massive flood event, and these photographs were used in the Met Office to record some of their document some of the flood aftermath and some of the meteorological records surrounding these events, which were huge in the context. He also did stuff of very local interest. So this is a sculptured stone, which still exists. I mean, it's still there. It's kind of partially submerged and a little bit sort of battered around the place. It was interesting that, you know, he describes it as a sculptured stone. It's part of his kind of tourism repertoire. You can find it these days. It is signposted, but my goodness me, it's not a you know, sort of on everybody's tourist itinerary at all. But back then, possibly it was, or maybe he made it that. Other things he documented were things like the armory at in Castle Grant, and this is a full plate size. All the pikes on the roof, various sort of targes, the sort of shields, and the sabres on the wall. It's a spectacular photograph in detail, all of which has gone. None of this is all scattered, and none of which exists. Well, the room exists, but none of the fitments are around. The museum has managed to get some of the pikes and one or two of the sort of bayonets in there, but on the whole, it's been completely dispersed and lost. So it's a really good record of how it was back in the early years. Things like bonspiel. Bonspiel is I think it's a Scottish term anyway. What it basically is outdoor curling on these rinks at Grantown, and Ledingham's got a series of pictures of this kind of action, and also a photograph of the Strathspey Curling Club, which was these were the winners of the Challenge Shield of the Grand Match in 1929. Which was held at Carsbreck in Perthshire. Now you can see here classic Ledingham, and I will come back to this a little bit later on. But you've got all the guys there with their stones and their brooms and their shiny shoes, all posing. But obviously somebody was missing, so he's just been sort of cut out, clapped on the photograph just to include him. And again, all these people are named, and you know it's a fantastic record. And for Grantown, it was a spectacular achievement of sending their local team down to the challenge of the Grand Match. The Grand Match is I should mention is held very, very occasionally. I can't even think when the last one was. I think in 2010 they tried to have it but couldn't. It has been quite often at the Lake of Menteith down in Perthshire, and it is basically a meeting of all the curlers in Scotland who come together on a whole series of rinks. Dozens of rinks, and they compete with each other. Certain sense, you wonder with climate change whether we'll ever have that again. Possibly not. Quite possibly not. This was the last time. These are two of my photographs. I'm just putting in just as a sort of link to the present. These were photographs I took in 2003 when there was a pretty big match for the north of Scotland on the rinks in. On the ponds at Grantown on Spey. It's not happened since, so you know, again, it's quite possibly a thing of the past. Summer activities on the Spey. Not a photograph you'd take these days. I think you'd be arrested on the spot. But you know, nonetheless, the bathing pool on the River Spey, just upstream from Grantown, is still a well-used location. There's a sandy beach and a deep pool, and before, you know, back in the day, it used to be the place where all the local kids congregated in the summer and just swam. Barely an adult in sight, and they're just all out there just enjoying themselves and having a great time in what was obviously good sunny weather in a wonderful location. Other aspects of the Spey, you know, a formal outdoor portrait of a gentleman with his fish. The Spey, as you'll know, is a great salmon, or was a great salmon river. It's struggling a bit at the moment, but I really like this image, and it portrays quite a coordinated service that was supplied in Grantown. So presumably this was coordinated by the gillie, the person that helped the fisherman fish his fish. The fish has been prepared; it's been tied onto a stick and hung on a stick for display. The gentleman has changed into his best attire from his fishing gear, and the photographer has been summoned to the beach in order to photograph him on the scene of his triumph with his rod and his prize. So just to dwell for a minute on Ledingham postcards, I'm going to go back to this picture. There are 285 postcards in the numbered range. I first discovered a Ledingham postcard in an antique shop. These were pre-eBay days when you had to actually go and look at somebody's kind of shoebox full of cards. You just hoped they divided them into sort of areas rather than just lobbing everything in a box, and you had to spend hours going through every single one of them. But anyway, I found a Ledingham card in an antique shop. It was number 86, and I was immediately thinking to myself, this is great. These are great images. I need to find the other 85. Well, a couple of weeks later, I stumbled upon number 202 in the bookshop in St Andrews, and I knew the whole task was a totally different scale. So my research shows there are 285 numbered cards, probably 150 to 200 what I've called event cards, so notable events around Grantown, which has been published as postcards. And then there are quite a few that are more to do with studio portraits and sort of the dressing up stuff, so studio generated material. The postcard range covers the Badenoch and Strathspey. It reaches into Nairnshire. They extend from Dulcie Bridge in the north, right up there at Dunfale, to Lochar and Bray Riach in the Cairngorms to the east, and to Kinlochnagan in the southwest, 40 or so miles to the Badenoch and Loch Arbour March. There were plenty of provincial photographers in many towns, some of the larger studios holding premises alongside local photographers who traded with portraits and maybe a few local postcards. But what I think was unprecedented at the time and is unusual is that Ledingham tried to cover the whole lot. He put together a postcard range. He did for Badenoch and Strathspey what J. Arthur Dixon did for the whole country, in the sort of 50s, 60s and 70s. I think that is quite unusual, if not, pretty unique, I would say, that he was doing this in the 19-teens and 1920s. And really the strength of his body of work is this breadth of material that he's done in a diversity of places. So there was a rail network at the time between Grantown and Newton Moor. I believe that Alex Ledingham travelled mainly by motorcycle. Here he is in his uniform on an old BSA. And first-hand testimony, I interviewed his son back in 2009. Unfortunately, he's died now, but I interviewed his son in 2009. He shared memories of riding for hours in a sidecar of a motorcycle, cradling glass plates and cameras, and squeezing in beside a tripod, and traveling 40 to 50 miles to go to a location and then back again in the same day, which these are journeys that would take an hour and a quarter to an hour and a half by car these days, and I would estimate 2 to 3 hours at least each way back in by motorcycle in the 1920s. Things were pretty rough then. So I mentioned that I'd sort of found number 86. Well, 86 happens to be about a kilometre from where I'm sitting now. It's the junction in Newton Moor. It's a beautifully posed photograph. Car and chauffeur outside the hotel. People posed in the street. 3 people on bikes further on. A really detailed photograph. The tree in the photograph still exists. It's still there, and that is one of the notable features of Newton Moor. But when you speak to other postcard collectors, and I've got one or two friends, I'm not particularly geeky about it, but I've got 1 or 2 friends who are postcard collectors, and they say to me something like, "Oh, right, those Ledingham things you collect, have you got number 86?" And I know that one. I said, "Well, yeah, I have." But what happens then is that the guy actually clicked a picture to me, and he sent me a picture, and I looked at it, and I thought, "Oh, well, hang on a minute. No, I don't have that one. That is number 86." And quite interestingly, I think what has happened here is that this is the original photograph. It's the dirt track, the dirt street, the main road through Newton Moor. Here we've got curbs. It's a later one, and I think this is a demonstration of something which I've now found quite widespread, is that you need an update. So postcard photographers particularly needed an update, and they updated their photographs quite regularly. And this is the kind of second version, number 86, after the roads had been curbed and things had been improved. And that was important for that to happen. This is a Ledingham advertisement at the time: local view postcards, photo frames and pictures, etc. in the studio Grantown-on-Spey. Natural portraiture of children, a speciality. Some of his photographs were a little bit cryptic. The Cairngorms, I spent a lot of time trying to work out where this was taken from. As I said earlier, and my thesis kind of bears it out, I was particularly interested in finding locations, looking at the views in a contemporary format. Couldn't work out where this one was, and it's obviously been produced for a specific market But very soon afterwards, I found another postcard, the same view, and somebody had actually taken it out of his hands and helpfully written on it that it was the Cairngorms from Dulnham Bridge. So that's one I have been able to track down. But I think, you know, it's quite a low production one, and probably, and in fact, bearing in mind that on the narrative on the back, it's actually produced for one particular outlet in Dulnham Bridge itself. So it's a bespoke publication for that particular place. The old bridge at Grantown on Spey was a regular feature. This is one of his stock photographs, to which he returned year after year after year. This is a very early photograph, probably about 1910, and the house Cherry Grove next door to that, or just in the view. The view hasn't really changed, apart from the fact that with most rephotography these days, it's very difficult to retake because of the trees in the front. But that's the old bridge at Grantown, which was one of his absolutely classic views. This was number 2 in his postcard series, and this is the approach to Grantown on Spey, and this was a view that Ledingham returned to time and time again. It threads all the way through his career. For 50 years he photographed this view, that milestone in the bottom, and sometimes, quite often, people in pretty much the same location. There's a path that actually crosses from Anagach Woods, which actually crosses the road there, and that's where those people are. So it was a really staple of his place, of his view. This one, another one. This is right next to a busy roundabout now, and the initial view on the left-hand side had his mate Angus Stewart on the left-hand side, both of them with bicycles, and on the right-hand side, parked on the bench, is Ledingham's camera bag and his plates, which are just sort of parked on the bench while he takes that photograph. The right hand side is a much later photograph, up until into the late 1930s, and but it's basically the same view, and you can just see some of the changes in that. But it's that updating of the postcard views which is necessary. Another one, this is Bridge of Brown 130. Is that, you know, do you have number 130? Well, yes, I do. Oh, well, no, I don't, because number 130 has been updated as well. It was re-roofed, the porch was put on the front, and we changed from this one, which, when you get into the detail of this, there's a sort of wonderful scene of white hens down there with a child feeding the hens, and somebody standing outside the cottage. And then you move to the new view. A child is still there, but much has changed. But again, it's that keeping the postcard world contemporary. If somebody bought a postcard in a shop, they wanted the view that they had just seen, not something that was 20 years old. Seems to be my impression. This was another view. This was another view of Ledingham's, of the railway just near Grantown. And here he has taken a picture. I think it's the postman going along the railway lines, because it's the quickest way to get to where he needed to get to, and he's obviously positioned him on the railway line, walking down the tracks there to get round to one of the farms just outside Grantown on Spey. The village of Carbridge, and here he has halted the horse and trap and got a dog in the middle of it. That's the Carbridge Hotel. It's a readily recognisable place for those of you who have been up here, but obviously much changed in the time. But it was just his composition of that, people on the bridge, and he'd obviously, as I say, halted the driver of the trap in order to compose and get that photograph. He also photographed in the Cairngorms itself. Among the Cairngorms plateau scenes are these. Well, there's a couple of memorial photographs. This one is a cairn which sits at Tulloch Grew, which is just at the edge of the Rothimercus. You're looking at the sun is on the Larry Grew, which is the pass through the Cairngorms in the background there. And Tulloch Grew, this view is nearly engulfed by trees now, but this is a memorial to Baird and Barry, who were lost in the Cairngorms in 1928. They were lost, and the search for them, and I think they were found some weeks later, but the search for them was one of the first coordinated, if not the first coordinated, mountain rescues. And it was so notable that Ledingham will have gone and recorded this. It was notorious, and the cairn to Barry is still a place to visit. This is an interesting photograph, not anybody's ideal tourist shot or souvenir shot particularly. It seems to be quite a rare one, but it is a photograph of the snow patch on the head wall of Corrie Cass. Corrie Cass is the ski area on Cairngorm. You'll all be aware of skiing and the nearby village of Aviemore. This is the head wall of the Cass, and it is one of two snow beds which is given a name. This one's called the Cooey Crom, the Crooked Wreath, and Ledingham will have documented that as a again tried to sell it as a postcard, and possibly quite successfully. Back at Grantown, one of his favourite views, this was the Spey, and a view that he returned to for the first 15-20 years of his career. It's a common feature of Ledingham's range. But lo and behold, somebody stuck a bridge in the middle of it at the end of the 20s. 1927, the new bridge across the Spey was opened, and you can see that he capitalised on that. His angle was perfect from the earlier shot. The old bridge of Grantown in the background there, the new bridge, 1927. Sort of just having been produced. Now, he'll have been frustrated, and I've got a number of examples of where he has actually doctored his plates quite severely. But this one particularly is one, if you look down below the arch of the bridge there, you can see where he has scored out the old scaffolding where they were building the bridge, which remained, apparently according to local records, that remained in the river for a year or two. And he's decided to try and excise that from the record. And he did one or two sort of doctors to his plates just in order to make it more saleable, I suspect, to make his plates more saleable. Bridges were a big part of him. This is the bridge at Advie, a brand new concrete bridge, opened in 1922. Anytime he was a sucker for a bridge. Anytime there was a bridge, there are stacks of cards there. And again, in the river channel there, you can see how they've built they've used scaffolding to build the bridge, which is still there. This is another bridge, Broomhill Bridge, which is near Nethy Bridge, if anybody's heard of that one. It's one of the old wooden bridges across the Spey, and these were built at the locations. This was the major improvement in the sort of mid to late 1800s, where there were what were called boats. The most famous one, the one we may have heard of, is called Boat of Garton, where there used to be a boat going across the river, and later there was a wooden bridge built like this. This Broomhill Bridge still survives, and there's one other at Kincraig, but they were both documented quite early in their furbishments by Alex Ledingham. If anybody's been to the RSPB Reserve at Abernethy, this is the Forest Lodge. This is the big timber frame building that they have in the forest. And looking at the Cairngorms in the background there, and in fact the top snow wreath about 2/3 to the right on the horizon is the one I've just showed you, the Cooey Crom. That's in the top of Corrie Cass, but that's a view of the Abernethy Forest and Forest Lodge, which at the time would have been privately owned and part of the forest estate. This is just down the road from me, a kilometre away, Newtonmore Golf Course, and I just want to sort of just finish a little bit on some of the stuff that I both use and beyond the research in these photographs. It provides, as I say, it provides this great documentary record. This is the golf course at Newtonmore. This is the sort of thing I do. I put it in the context of the present day. So that's that's a view from Alex Ledingham's vantage point, and just puts a bit more context into what the present is. Clearly, far more trees is a common theme in these kind of stories. But that's just some of the kind of the rephotographic side that I'm quite interested in, and use these pictures as a source. Another one I wanted just to show you was this sort of iconic picture of the Larry Grew. The Larry Grew, as I said earlier, is this pass that runs through the Cairngorms. It runs north-south, and it runs basically from Speyside to Deeside, and was an ancient routeway, and now extremely popular with tourists as well. Now, what's quite interesting about I mentioned earlier about the influences of other photographers. Oh, here we go. So for Alex Ledingham, his photograph is top left, and this was picked up by other publishing houses, particularly Valentine's, J.B. White, and later Whiteholm. And his picture basically, or the influence of his picture, basically perpetuated right onto the 1970s. The bottom right picture is a picture taken in the early 70s of the old tree, and it's gone now, but it just shows the kind of influence of an earlier photograph. And I think it's one of Ledingham's sort of finest achievement in the reach of that picture has influenced other publishing houses to document the same. And I think the reason for this, I'm not going to get diverted into it, but too far. But the reason for that is that quite often a publishing house would say, "Well, this is a great photograph." They give them a copy of the picture, tell their journeyman photographers to go out, take a picture like that, and they would go out and pretty well take the same kind of view, just to replicate it in their view. So again, that's the sort of thing I do. I took the 1970s picture, went up onto Larry Grew, and put it in place. The tree is gone. There is absolutely no sign of the tree, but I took that from the vantage point of the 1970s picture, just to put it in the context of another blue sky day in the Cairngorms. Another one, and this one is about 50 yards from my house, is a view from the bridge and the Spey of Newton Moor, and it's taken from the new bridge of Newton Moor, looking out onto the Spey, the Spey floodplain. There's a train heading south in the background on the Highland main line, and the rock on the left called Polcregan. It's part of a salmon pool, and that one's an interesting one to see, because that's exactly the same picture, exactly the same view. Taken again, and it just shows you the changes in grazing pressure. I suppose it tells you that there's something slightly different in terms of the River Spey. His picture was taken before the River Spey was dammed, but his photographs provide us with a documentary plot on the graph of change. They sort of talk about where the changes are sort of coming on, and just to compare side by side, that's the view nowadays. And changes in grazing pressure, changes in land use, sort of massive kind of document between, I think this one is 1927, and this one was last year. I retook the picture. Okay, so Alex Ledingham, this is him in his shop, 60 the High Street, with his wife Margaret. He left behind him a wealth of memories for locals. The archive as such, as I mentioned earlier, exists in many places. The core is of some glass plates, which are held by Grantown Museum, many of which have been lost. The family told me that they tried to find anyone interested in taking the archive back in the 1980s. They tried the various small museums up here. Nobody would take them. And they ended up, quite a lot of them were used in the garden as sort of cloches for, salad and vegetables, early growth, just lined out on their veg plots. And they just declined the offer. And when I sought advice on because I'd lined up with what material they had left, and I tried to get this into the museum, and I spoke to the Scottish National Archives, and I said, we've got this collection, and they summed it up quite well, because they said, well, look, what have you got? What have they got? Have you got something that's of local, national, or international significance? Now, I don't know. It's certainly of local significance. As I say, his archive is kind of scattered all over the place. It's in private collections, one or two museum public collections, but it is certainly, and I think also of Scottish national kind of importance, but maybe not of international importance. So finally, just a shameless plug for the book we produced. If anybody would like a copy, please get in touch with me, petermoorephotos@gmail.com. The book is £15. I will include postage in that, no problem at all, particularly for this. It's 210mm square, 60 pages long, perfect copy, and showcases a lot of Ledingham's photographs. There's about 80 something photographs in there, most of which were in the exhibition, and it's sort of like an exhibition catalogue, but also an essay of the history of his particular practice and enterprise. Okay, I'm there. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you very much, Peter. That was really, really interesting, and it shows, I think, how how something that might appear local actually is much more significant. And I really enjoyed looking at your re-photography as well. I think there's a lot of mileage there, because particularly in terms of a geography and showing changes to place and land use. And there's lots of really good, interesting work being done looking at the retreat of glaciers and all sorts of things. So really enjoyed that. I've got a couple of questions here. And first one was asking whether any of Ledingham's business records survived. Did any of that survive, even if some of his negatives didn't survive?
Business records, I somehow doubt it. I mean, I got a lot of information from the back issues of the Grantown supplement, which seemed to be his vehicle for putting notices out, but his actual accounts and business records, doubt it very much. Alex Ledingham finished trading in 1954, and his son took on the business until the 1980s. But so there was Alex Ledingham, and then there was Sandy Ledingham. Sandy Ledingham basically ran more of a camera shop, but I don't think the early Ledingham records of business transactions exists.
And you mentioned earlier on in your presentation about Ledingham's hand colouring, and was he art trained? Did he attend an art college before he moved into Dumfries initially?
No, I don't think so. I think he left home. No, his first step was down to Peebles, and I think he just left home and became an assistant photographer. So any hand tinting he did will have been something he either picked up or improvised on. He was a great sort of hands-on photographer, and a lot of his, for example, these composite photographs where in his latter, maybe in the 1930s, he produced a composite photograph with with 4 pictures on to try and sort of promote Grantown on Spey. And he actually did those by putting basically 4 photographs down with Grantown written in the middle, photographing them, producing them like that. I mean, he was a hands-on technician. So I think the hand production of his photo artistry was part of his practice, but I don't think he was a trained artist.
And the final question I've got through here is asking whether you've got the complete set from 1 to 200 and whatever odd, or do you still have some gaps?
I still have gaps. I still definitely have gaps. Yeah, and what's quite interesting about the whole thing? Well, interesting. I mean, it's interesting for me, but is the variance within some of the photographs where you get the sort of the updates coming through. So there's probably over 300. I've probably got about maybe 200, 220. But there are sort of odd pictures, and what I would call odd pictures. Ones that he maybe photographed just once, and they're really bizarre pictures. They're not pictures you'd buy, I don't think. So I'll give you an example. There's a picture of a bucket bridge. Now, a bucket bridge is basically a cableway bucket which sits on a cableway going across the river, and particularly up on the River Dolman, which is a flash flood river. And he's got a postcard produced of that, and I have seen a copy of it, but I don't actually have one. I suspect only about one sold, sort of idea. So there are some pretty obscure images for me to keep looking for.
When you interviewed his son, did you get any sense that Alex was photographing not just for commercial reasons, but was perhaps thinking about posterity and wanting to leave a record? Like the bucket bridge, as you say, it's not particularly commercial, but actually it's really interesting probably to us now.
I think you're right, and I think there is certainly. I think he certainly had that. There was an indication of that certainly in his early work with doing the documentary of all the events. And I think you're probably right that will have kind of driven his practice in order to record that. Now, as I say, whether you do that and then hope to evangelize that to your audience, I don't know. But certainly, I mean, there's certainly enough things that he had on his files or has on his files which weren't actually produced as postcards. There's an awful lot of other stuff as well. So yeah.
Okay. We don't have any more questions in the chat now, so I think we've gone through all the questions. So I think it just falls to me then to firstly say thank you very much indeed for your time this evening, and it was well worth waiting for. So we appreciate that, and reiterate that we If anyone is interested in the book, please make contact. We'll circulate Peter's details when we make the recording available. And so thank you, Peter, for your time this evening. And again, thank you, Gilly, for helping to arrange this evening and making the introduction. And our next talk will be on the 23rd of May, I think it is. And we'll be looking at Julia Margaret Cameron through the eyes of a researcher that's done some really interesting new work on Cameron and her photographs. So thank you, Peter. Thank you, Gilly. And thank you to our audience this evening. Good night, everyone.